in a school in Bedford-Stuyvesant on Herkimer Street. At that time, it was called PS 28. And when I started teaching there in 1950, I was the first teacher of African ancestry in that school. I was not allowed to eat in the lunchroom with the
What?
European teachers. I had to eat. I didn't know that, so when lunchtime came, I took my lunch and walked into the room where the teachers were eating lunch, and they told me, "Oh, well, you can't come in here. You can't
What?
eat with us."
What year was that?
1950. That was
What?
October of 1950. So for the first, I would say, 3 years, I ate alone in my classroom because I was not allowed to eat in the room with the European teachers who were there.
What?
So I think it's important that that history be known, because sometimes we think that things were just handed to us, and they were not. We had to have great resilience, we had to have great self-confidence, and we had to have a belief in the worthiness of what we were doing. I was assigned to a class that was called an opportunity class. It was made up of boys only, and these boys were 4th, 5th, and 6th grade boys who were considered recalcitrant, stubborn, not in any way unintelligent, because at that time they didn't have a category called special education, but they did have classes for mental retardation. It was called CRMD, children with mental retardation. They were not retarded, but they were behavior problems, theoretically. And my assignment was just to keep them in the class. Not to teach them anything, but just to keep them from annoying the teachers by running up and down the hall and banging on the doors of the classrooms. That was my assignment. It had nothing to do with teaching them to read or write or speak or do mathematics. And so I took that assignment, and these young boys told me that I wasn't going to stay because they had already gotten rid of 5 teachers before I came. And so they knew that I wouldn't last either. It was sort of a joke, how many can we get rid of? But of course I explained to them that I would stay, that I cared about them, and that I needed a job. And just make up your mind that we're going to get along. Well, they put me through some very difficult and embarrassing situations before they finally realized that I was going to stay. But what was the most important lesson that I got from those boys. They would not read. They absolutely would not read. And finally they told me, after a series of rather embarrassing experiences that I had, going to the principal, asking them for different reading series and so forth. But they told me, they said, I don't read because I don't like that book. I don't have no damn daddy. I've never seen no picket fence, and all the dogs that I see are hungrier than I am.
What?
So we don't want to read that. Now this was the young man, David Roselle was his name. I'll never forget David. He was the chairman of the board. He spoke for the class. And I said, well, what do you want to read? And they said, I want to read about me. I want to read about my life. I want to read about the things that happen to me every day, because I think that they're more interesting and they're important, and nobody else has written about them. So I said to them, if you will tell me your story, I can teach you to read with your story. So I got large poster paper, and I had them to tell me their story, and I credited them as the author. I said, you're the author of this book that's going to be about the story of the boys in our class. And they were incredible stories. They talked about how to open a can of beans without a can opener, how to compete with the rats and the roaches, how the roaches only came out when you turned the lights off. They hid when the lights were on, but they would come out in the dark. They talked about the stairs that had holes in them. They talked about how the whole house shook when the Long Island Railroad went by. This was before the housing project was built, and they lived along Atlantic Avenue and Herkimer Street, and the Long Island Railroad ran overhead there, and it made the houses shake. And they wrote the most beautiful stories about their life, and how they imagined where the people were going on the train, and how the people looked, and they could only see the people's heads, but they wondered what the rest of them looked at. They were wonderful stories, and each story was credited. This is David's story. This is Juan's story. This is Mark's story. And then I used the approach that was in the teacher's guide. Find the smaller words, find the rhyming words, use the sentence in a different way. Be sure you put the question mark. But they were willing to do it because it was their story. So that's when I learned that children want to read about themselves and about their life and about their longings and about their hopes and their disappointments and their hurt and their pain. And then you can take them from there to the next level. But first you have to let them talk about themselves, and you have to validate who they are, whatever the condition is, whatever the pain and the disappointment. And they do have pain and disappointment and depression. And when the time came for the standardized test, they weren't expected to take it. Mr. Finkelstein said, oh no, we don't test them. They will bring down our test scores. I said, oh, but they should be tested. They should. We aced the test. And it was the first time that the administration of the school even recognized the fact that these boys had potential. And I followed them as long as I could, but I left 28 when PS 21 opened in 1956.